Chapter 1: The Time Machine. Jane had always been fascinated by the concept of time travel. As a scientist, she had dedicated her life to studying the mysteries of time and space. And when she finally built her own time machine, she knew that she had to try it out for herself. The machine was a sleek, metallic pod that stood in the center of her laboratory. Its surface gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and a low hum emanated from within. Jane approached the machine, her heart pounding with excitement and nerves. She took a deep breath and climbed inside the pod, settling into the narrow seat. She closed her eyes and took a moment to calm her racing thoughts. Then she pressed the button, and the machine sprang to life. There was a blinding flash of light, and then Jane felt a sudden lurch in her stomach. She opened her eyes and gasped as the world around her blurred and twisted. Colors merged and separated in a kaleidoscope of motion, and she felt as though she were hurtling through space and time. Finally, the motion slowed, and Jane felt the machine shudder to a halt. She opened her eyes and blinked, trying to adjust to her new surroundings. The room around her was dimly lit and unfamiliar, with strange, futuristic technology lining the walls. She climbed out of the machine and stepped gingerly onto the cool, metal floor. She looked around, taking in the sleek, sterile environment of the laboratory. This was not the world she had expected to see. Jane had programmed the machine to take her 100 years into the future, but she had not anticipated this level of advancement. The technology around her was so far beyond anything she had imagined that it was almost alien. As she explored the laboratory, Jane marveled at the devices and equipment that lined the walls. She examined a machine that appeared to be a prototype for teleportation, and she marveled at a device that seemed to manipulate the very fabric of space and time. But as she explored, she began to sense a growing unease. She felt as though she was being watched, as though there were eyes upon her from every corner of the room. And as she turned a corner, she saw a shadow dart across the floor. Jane's heart leaped into her throat. She had not expected to encounter anyone in this laboratory, let alone someone who might pose a threat. She knew that she had to be cautious and that she had to find a way out of this strange, futuristic world and return to her own time. But as she moved deeper into the laboratory, she realized that escaping would be more difficult than she had anticipated. The technology around her was so far beyond her understanding that she had no idea where to begin. Jane's mind raced as she searched for a way out. She knew that she had to think fast if she was going to get out of this futuristic world alive. Chapter 2: Lost in Time. Jane blinked her eyes as she tried to make sense of the world around her. The last thing she remembered was stepping into her time machine and programming it to take her 100 years into the future. But when she stepped out, she found herself in a place that looked nothing like the future she had imagined. The air was thick with pollution, and the sky was a sickly shade of gray. The streets were barren, and buildings were in ruins. The only sounds that echoed were the rustling of the leaves and the distant hum of machines. Jane couldn't believe her eyes. This couldn't be the future. It was a nightmare. She looked down at her time machine, which had suffered some damage during the journey, and realized that she was stranded in this desolate place. She had no idea where she was or how she would get back to her own time. Panic set in as she realized the gravity of the situation. She had no food, no water, and no shelter. All she had was her wits and the determination to survive. Jane took a deep breath and started walking. She had to find help or at least some answers. As she wandered through the abandoned streets, she felt a sense of dread building inside her. The world was unrecognizable, and she had no idea what had happened to cause such devastation. Suddenly, she heard a noise coming from one of the nearby buildings. She cautiously made her way towards it, her heart racing with fear and anticipation. As she approached the building, she heard voices inside. Peeking through a broken window, she saw a group of people huddled together in a room. They were dirty, tired, and looked like they had been through a lot. But they were alive, and that was enough for Jane. She knocked on the door, and the group jumped at the sound. One of the men, a burly figure with a beard, cautiously opened the door and peered out. "Who are you? What do you want?" he growled. "I'm Jane. I'm a time traveler, and I'm lost. I don't know how I got here or what happened to the world," Jane said, trying to sound as calm as possible. The man looked at her skeptically but motioned for her to come inside. Jane stepped into the room and looked around. The walls were lined with makeshift beds, and a fire burned in the corner. The group gathered around her, asking her questions and studying her with suspicion. But as Jane explained her situation and showed them her damaged time machine, they started to believe her. They told her that the world had been destroyed by war and environmental disasters. The survivors had banded together to build a new society, but life was hard. Food was scarce, and the air was toxic. The future looked bleak. Jane realized that she had to help these people. She had to find a way back to her own time, but she also had to make sure that the events that had led to the downfall of civilization were prevented. She spent the next few days studying the survivors' way of life, learning from them, and trying to find a way back home. But as she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that the future was already set in motion and that she might be powerless to change it. Despite her doubts, Jane refused to give up. She was determined to find a way to make a difference, to leave her mark on the world, and to make sure that the future she had seen never came to pass. Chapter 3: A New World. As Jane settled into her new life with the survivors, she found herself constantly amazed by the resilience and resourcefulness of the people around her. They had built a new society from the ruins of the old one, using whatever materials they could find to construct homes and infrastructure. Jane spent most of her time working with the other scientists in the group, studying the world around them and trying to understand what had gone wrong. Together, they pored over old records and scientific journals, looking for any clues that might help them prevent the disaster that had destroyed their world. One day, as Jane was walking through the ruins of an old factory, she stumbled across an old document that caught her eye. It was a patent for a new kind of solar panel, one that was capable of generating far more energy than any other technology currently available. Excited by the potential of this discovery, Jane brought the patent back to the other scientists, and they immediately set to work trying to replicate the technology. It wasn't easy, but after months of experimentation and tweaking, they finally succeeded in creating a working prototype. The survivors were overjoyed by the new technology, and they immediately set to work building solar farms and power stations all over their new world. The air began to clear, and the sky grew brighter as the smog began to dissipate. Jane knew that they had made a huge difference in the world, but she couldn't help feeling a sense of unease. She knew that they still had a long way to go if they wanted to prevent the disaster that had destroyed their world. As the months went by, Jane became increasingly obsessed with finding a way to prevent the future that she had seen. She spent long hours poring over old records and consulting with the other scientists, searching for any clue that might help them save the world. And then, one day, she found it. In an old journal from a long-dead scientist, she discovered a formula for a new kind of fuel, one that was capable of powering entire cities without producing any harmful emissions. Excited by the potential of this discovery, Jane brought the formula back to the other scientists, and they immediately set to work trying to replicate it. It wasn't easy, but after months of experimentation and tweaking, they finally succeeded in creating a working prototype. Jane knew that they had found the key to preventing the disaster that had destroyed their world. With clean energy and fuel, the survivors could build a new world without having to worry about the environmental consequences. As she looked out over the new world that she had helped to create, Jane couldn't help feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment. She had made a difference in the world, and she knew that her actions would have a lasting impact on the future. But as she sat down to rest, she couldn't help wondering what other secrets the future held. What other discoveries might be waiting to be made, and what other challenges lay ahead for the survivors. Only time would tell, but Jane was ready to face whatever the future held. Chapter 4: Searching for Answers. Jane continued to search through the records, hoping to find more answers to the questions that plagued her. She came across a journal entry from a scientist who had been working on a top-secret project before the world had fallen apart. The scientist wrote about a discovery that could change the course of humanity forever. It was a new technology that could create an unlimited source of clean energy, but the project had been shut down due to fears that it could be weaponized. Jane's heart raced as she read through the journal entry, realizing that this technology could be the key to preventing the catastrophic events that had led to the world's downfall. She shared the information with the other scientists in the group, and they worked tirelessly to track down any remaining information about the project. They scoured old government files and interviewed former employees until they finally found what they were looking for. The technology had been hidden away in a secret government facility, and the survivors knew that they had to retrieve it if they wanted to save the world. Jane and a team of survivors set out on a dangerous mission to infiltrate the facility and retrieve the technology. They faced numerous obstacles and setbacks along the way, but they refused to give up. Finally, after weeks of planning and preparation, they made their way into the facility and found the technology. It was in a state of disrepair, but they knew that they could fix it and use it to save the world. With the help of the other scientists, Jane worked tirelessly to repair the technology and integrate it into their existing system. It was a long and arduous process, but they knew that they were running out of time. Finally, the day arrived when they were ready to activate the new technology. The survivors gathered around as Jane flipped the switch, and a bright light filled the room. The technology worked perfectly, creating an unlimited source of clean energy that could power the world for centuries. The survivors cheered as they realized that they had finally found a way to prevent the catastrophic events that had destroyed the world. As Jane looked around at the smiling faces of the survivors, she felt a sense of hope and optimism that she hadn't felt in a long time. They had accomplished what many thought was impossible, and they had done it together. Jane knew that there would still be challenges ahead, but she was confident that they could overcome them. They had found the answers they were looking for, and they had a bright future ahead of them. Chapter 5: The Power of the Sun. Jane worked tirelessly with the survivors to build the technology that would harness the power of the sun to generate clean energy. She spent long hours poring over old records and consulting with the other scientists in the group, using her knowledge of time travel to her advantage. As they worked, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that she was running out of time. She knew that the catastrophic events that had destroyed the future she had seen were already set in motion, and that she had to act fast to prevent them from happening. Despite the urgency of the situation, Jane was careful and meticulous in her work. She made sure that every detail was perfect, knowing that even the slightest mistake could have catastrophic consequences. Finally, after months of hard work, the technology was ready. Jane stood with the survivors, looking out over the ruins of their world, as they prepared to put her discovery to the test. They activated the machine, and slowly, a faint glow began to emanate from the device. The glow grew brighter and brighter until it was a blinding light, and then suddenly, the sky overhead cleared, the smog and pollution dissipated, and the air became clear and breathable. Everyone gasped in amazement as the world around them transformed. The buildings, once in ruins, began to rebuild themselves, as if by magic. The streets were no longer deserted but filled with people going about their lives. Jane was overjoyed to see the difference her discovery had made. But even as she celebrated the success of the project, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to be done. As they watched the world being reborn around them, Jane realized that preventing the environmental disaster was only the first step. They still had to deal with the war that had ravaged the planet. And so Jane devoted herself to finding a way to prevent the war from happening. She knew that she had the knowledge and the technology to do it, but it would require even more hard work and dedication. Jane spent months studying the records and consulting with the other scientists in the group until she finally discovered the key to preventing the war. She shared her discovery with the survivors, who worked tirelessly to implement her plan. Finally, the day came when Jane's time machine was repaired and ready to take her back to her own time. She said goodbye to the survivors, grateful for the time she had spent with them and for the difference they had made together. As she stepped into the machine, she felt a sense of sadness and loss, knowing that she was leaving behind a world that had become like home to her. But she was also filled with hope, knowing that she had made a difference in the world and that the future she had seen was no longer inevitable. As the machine whirred to life, Jane closed her eyes and held on tight, bracing herself for the journey back to her own time. She knew that she would never forget the lessons she had learned and that she would always be grateful for the time she had spent in the future. Chapter 6: A Race Against Time. Jane's heart was pounding as she stared at the controls of her time machine. She had to hurry if she was going to prevent the catastrophic events that she knew were coming. With shaky fingers, she entered the coordinates for the year 2040 and hit the Go button. The machine whirred to life, and Jane felt the familiar sensation of time travel washes over her. She closed her eyes and braced herself for the impact of her arrival. When she opened them again, she found herself in a dark alleyway, surrounded by the crumbling ruins of buildings. She knew that she had arrived in the heart of the dystopian future that she had seen before. But this time, she wasn't alone. The survivors had followed her, determined to help her stop the events that would lead to their destruction. "Okay, we need to find the facility where the nuclear warhead is being stored," Jane said, her voice steady and determined. "Once we're there, we can disable it before it can be launched." The survivors nodded, and they set off through the dark and deserted streets. Jane led the way, her mind racing as she tried to remember the layout of the city. She had seen it before in her visions, but seeing it in person was so different. As they approached the facility, Jane's heart sank. It was heavily guarded, with armed soldiers patrolling the perimeter. But they had to get inside. They had no other choice. "We'll split up," Jane said, her voice low. "I'll take out the guards at the front gate. The rest of you find a way to get inside and find the warhead." The survivors nodded, and they split up. Jane crept up to the front gate, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath and then leaped out of the shadows, her fists flying. The guards were taken by surprise, and they didn't stand a chance against Jane's lightning-fast reflexes. She took them out one by one, her muscles burning with exertion. When the last guard fell to the ground, she wiped the sweat from her brow and gestured for the others to join her. They made their way into the facility, avoiding detection as they crept through the shadows. Finally, they found the warhead, its sleek and deadly form glinting in the dim light. Jane quickly got to work, pulling out the wires and disabling the launch mechanism. The survivors watched in amazement as she worked, their hearts pounding with fear and anticipation. Finally, the job was done. Jane stood up and wiped the sweat from her brow. She felt a sense of relief flood through her, knowing that she had saved the world from destruction. But as they made their way back to the time machine, Jane's mind was already racing with new ideas. She had prevented one disaster, but what other challenges lay ahead? She knew that she had to keep working, keep pushing the boundaries of science, and keep striving to create a better future for all.